Chapter 9. A chapter not strictly necessary. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. Numbers 13:33. The last two chapters have been concerned with objections to miracle, made, so to speak, from the inside or from the side of nature, made on the ground that she is the sort of system which could not admit miracles. Our next step, if we followed a strict order, would be to consider objections from the opposite side. In fact, to inquire whether what is beyond nature can reasonably be supposed to be the sort of being that could or would work miracles. But I find myself strongly disposed to turn aside and face first an objection of a different sort. It is a purely emotional one. Severer readers may skip this chapter, but I know it is one which weighed very heavily with me at a certain period of my life, and if others have passed through the same experience, they may care to read of it. One of the things that held me back from supernaturalism was a deep repugnance to the view of nature which, as I thought, supernaturalism entailed. I passionately desired that nature should exist on her own. The idea that she had been made and could be altered by God seemed to take from her all that spontaneity which I found so refreshing. In order to breathe freely, I wanted to feel that in nature one reached at last something that simply was. The thought that she had been manufactured or put there, and put there with a purpose, was suffocating. I wrote a poem in those days about a sunrise, I remember, in which, after describing the scene, I added that some people liked to believe that there was a spirit behind it all, and that this spirit was communicating with them. But, said I, that was exactly what I did not want. The poem was not much good, and I have forgotten most of it, but it ended up by saying how much rather I would feel that, in their own right, earth and sky continually do dance, for their own sakes, and here crept I to watch the world by chance. By chance. One could not bear to feel that the sunrise had been in any way arranged, or had anything to do with oneself. To find that it had not simply happened, that it had been somehow contrived, would be as bad as finding that the field mouse I saw beside some lonely hedge was really a clockwork mouse, put there to amuse me, or, worse still, to point some moral lesson. I can understand his feeling here. He calls this a chapter not strictly necessary because this may not be a pressing issue for most people. Maybe this isn't how they feel. But I feel this way with most things that I find in entertainment, in movies, in TV, in streaming series. I find it difficult to watch a lot of it because I feel like it is contrived. And I know it's contrived because it's obviously a production. It's not real. These are actors. It's a setting, a scene that's been built. But when I can sense that, the more I can sense that, the less disposed I am to watch it. Right? And that's probably most people. I'm not saying anything unique about myself. I don't like that feeling of that manufactured feeling of something. I want something authentic. I want something real. I think that's why so much of the entertainment today is difficult to watch or difficult to identify with, because a lot of it does verge on propaganda. There's an intent to impose some moral or political, even worse, even more disgusting, some political message on the listener, rather than it just being a story that moral lessons come out of because they happen by organic and natural processes of writing and telling a story or observing the hero's journey, and maybe that's the distinction. The real story is a moral lesson. The authentic story is a moral lesson. It's just not one that is consciously and intentionally driven into you moment by moment in the story. It's something that you and the writer both realize together. The writer as he or she is writing, and the reader or watcher as he or she is watching and listening. So I get what he's saying here. I get that it's a repugnant thing to look at. It would be a repugnant thing to look at nature and go, this isn't. I'm supposed to believe that all of this is pointing to some moral lesson, to that it's all contrived, that there's a tinkerer behind the scenes. It's making it all happen. I want to get to something that's finally wild. You know, I get out of the city because I want to get away from the city. I get out of the. I want to go out to nature. I want to go stand in a field. I want to go stand on top of a mountain and feel that I'm finally away from everything that is manufactured. I'm at the real, right? I'm at the truly authentic. And that's what I think, that's one of the reasons that nature is appealing to people, because you get away from anything that's orchestrated, right? When you're in the city, everything is orchestrated. When you're among other people, most things are orchestrated, and they have to be, because if things were just left to grow wild or to take over, then a lot of discomfort would occur. A lot of people, most people would be well, they'd be in danger, really, because nature is a dangerous thing. But sometimes you want to be close to that danger. Every once in a while, you want to get away from the curated world that you live in the city, and be next to things that where there is a possibility of danger. There's a little bit of a thrill in that, right? And
and why do you suppose that? I don't know, that want to get back to that state, that natural state. Why do you suppose that craving is in most, if not in every person? You gave an example. C.S. Lewis is wanting to get back to, get back to nature, right? People wanting to get out of the city, back to the real.
mm,
Well, what's so real about it? Why do you suppose people want to get back to that place?
I think it's the same sense that we were talking about when we're talking about a show or a series. You know a good story when you hear it. You know an authentic story when you hear it, when you're watching it. You know a good actor when you're watching him or her. You can see in them that it's effortless. They're not trying. You know, I think it's the same thing there. When you're stopping at the stoplight and there are speed limits, and your car is humming along, and you have appointments to get to, and bills to pay, and concerns to be obsessing over in your mind. These are all things that you know are heavily curated, and they have to be. I'm not critiquing that. They have to be curated, but there's I think there's a deep inkling inside that says this isn't. There's, in some sense, this is fabricated. There's a sense in which all of this is fabricated, and the authentic,
You're saying it's not natural.
it's not natural. Yeah, that it's not natural, and there's maybe this is what this is the same motivation, I suppose, that Rousseau had when he was theorizing about what the ideal person looked like, what ideal freedom looked like. I don't know, because I don't know enough about him to say, but maybe that was it. He looked around and he saw the I'm going to use the word again, the curated look of modern society, even in his day, what was modern for his day, and felt a little repugnance at it. You know, I want to get in touch with what is authentic and natural, what comes about of its own accord, what arises without any solicitation. Maybe we're being too generous with him. I really don't know, but I can certainly identify with the need to touch the real, and I think that's what Lewis is talking about here when he's saying that in my earlier days as a young man, I would look at things like a sunset or a mouse that pops out of a hedgerow of bushes, and I wanted to know that wasn't part of some
Grand design.
Exactly, well put. It wasn't part of some grand design, that it was happening on its own, that that mouse was a mouse in its own right. It wasn't put there. That would be the worst part, that it was put there to teach me something, right? That it just was happening, that it was wild. And that's why he calls this a chapter not strictly necessary, because maybe this is something that other people just haven't had a problem with. And so, you know, the deeper, the more serious reader, he calls them, can move on. But this is something that I dealt with. We read on, and he quotes a Greek poet here. He says, "The Greek poet asks, if water sticks in your throat, what will you take to wash it down? I likewise asked, if nature herself proves artificial, where will you go to seek wildness? Where is the real out of doors? To find that all the woods, and small streams in the middle of the woods, and odd corners of mountain valleys, and the wind and the grass were only a sort of scenery, only backcloths for some kind of play, and that play perhaps one with a moral. What flatness! What an anticlimax! What an unendurable bore! The cure of this mood began years ago, but I must record that the cure was not complete until I began to study this question of miracles. At every stage in the writing of this book I have found my idea of nature becoming more vivid and more concrete. I set out on a work which seemed to involve reducing her status and undermining her walls at every turn. The paradoxical result is a growing sensation that if I am not very careful, she will become the heroine of my book. She has never seemed to me more great or more real than at this moment, and you could probably imagine him starting to write this book and thinking, well, what I really got to do is tear down what nature is. I have to analyze what nature is and take it apart piece by piece. Because for most people who object to miracles, as we've read in the previous chapters, for most people who object to miracles, the problem is that nature is this bastion that cannot be assaulted by anything from the outside. It has ramparts that are insurmountable. Can't be got over, can't be got through. So what Lewis had to do, I'm sure as he was planning this book, thinking about how he would write it, one of the things he probably thought he had to do was, I've got to tear nature down. And as someone who used to hold this view that I'd like nature to be natural, I'd like it to be uninhibited, I'd like there to be something that finally was out of doors, as he put it, that probably was like, well, I am going to be this person. I am going to be this person that turns nature into a moral, into an ethic that is there to teach us something that's merely there as an instructor, and not really something that's just there to be observed in its own right. The best art, and we've kind of talked about that with movies or series you might watch, but the best art, you want that. I think, as far as I'm concerned, as far as my experience has taught me, you want art to be art for art's sake, not for any particular reason, but just because it's beautiful, and for no other reason. Beauty as beauty, purely, with no additions. Just let me see the beautiful, right? It doesn't have to have any. It doesn't have to have any plan to it, you know. It almost feels, I think, again, coming back to what propaganda really is, it almost feels like when you look at Soviet art, when you look at Marxist-inspired art, it's not art. It's an art for a political purpose, right? It's there to teach you a political lesson, to awaken a consciousness of your identity with your class, or to paint the enemies of history, the bourgeoisie, as the enemies that they are, right? It's there to teach you a lesson, and not really to reveal anything about existence or human nature or truth or beauty. It's not there to reveal anything. It's there to teach, and that's, you can see it in it too. You don't have to even be all that educated about the matter to know that you're being instructed and not being stirred, you know, as the human that you are. So I think that Lewis probably felt like, well, gosh, I've got to do this again. I've got to go back and be that man that I didn't want to be, that man that saw nature as a machine that's being tinkered with. And he says, well, but as I continue to write this, I see that what's really happening as I'm writing this book is that far from turning nature into a sideshow, something that's just a play being carried out on a stage, I risk nature becoming the heroine of my story, the main star. And so he goes on to talk about what he means by that. The reason is not far to seek. As long as one is a naturalist, nature is only a word for everything. And everything is not a subject about which anything very interesting can be said, or, save by illusion, felt. One aspect of things strikes us and we talk of the peace of nature. Another strikes us and we talk of her cruelty. And then, because we falsely take her for the ultimate and self-existent fact and cannot quite repress our high instinct to worship the self-existent, we are all at sea, and our moods fluctuate, and nature means to us whatever we please as the moods select and slur. But everything becomes different when we recognize that nature is a creature, a created thing, with its own particular tang or flavor. There is no need any longer to select and slur. It is not in her, but in something, with a capital S, far beyond her, that all lines meet and all contrasts are explained. It is no more baffling that the creature called nature should be both fair and cruel than that the first man you meet in the train should be a dishonest grocer and a kind husband. For she is not the absolute. She is one of the creatures, with her good points and her bad points, and her own unmistakable flavor running through them all. To say that God has created her is not to say that she is unreal, but precisely that she is real. Would you make a God less creative than Shakespeare or Dickens? When he creates, what he creates is created in the round. It is far more concrete than Falstaff or Sam Weller. The theologians certainly tell us that he created nature freely. They mean that he was not forced to do so by any external necessity. There would be the propagandist artist who's creating something because he's forced to by a political ideology or even by a government itself. God wasn't forced to create nature. It was like the artist who just wanted to paint, right? And even that probably doesn't get in all of God's motivations. You know, anytime we say something like that, or there's always some sort of hesitation in you to go, well, it's like that, but not completely like that, right? But something like that. Maybe we can say that it was something like that. The artist that was compelled to paint or compelled to draw or compelled to sculpt. That's where you get good art, right? You get good art because it's in some sense unsolicited. They mean that he was not forced to do so by any external necessity. But we must not interpret freedom negatively, as if nature were a mere construction of parts arbitrarily stuck together. God's creative freedom is to be conceived as the freedom of a poet, the freedom to create a consistent, positive thing with its own inimitable flavor. Shakespeare need not create Falstaff, but if he does, Falstaff must be fat. God need not create this nature. He might have created others. He may have created others. But granted this nature, then doubtless no smallest part of her is there except but it expresses the character he chose to give her. It would be a miserable error to suppose that the dimensions of space and time, the death and rebirth of vegetation, the unity and multiplicity of organisms, the union in opposition of sexes, and the color of each particular apple in Herefordshire this autumn were merely a collection of useful devices forcibly welded together. They are the very idiom, almost the facial expression, the smell or taste of an individual thing. The quality of nature is present in them all, just as the Latinity of Latin is present in every inflection, or the Coraggiosity of Correggio in every stroke of the brush. Nature is by human and probably by divine standards partly good and partly evil. We Christians believe that she has been corrupted, but the same tang or flavor runs through both her corruptions and her excellences. Everything is in character. Falstaff does not sin in the same way as Othello. Othello's fall bears a close relation to his virtues. If Perdita had fallen, she would not have been bad in the same way as Lady Macbeth. If Lady Macbeth had remained if Lady Macbeth had remained good, her goodness would have been quite different from that of Perdita. The evils we see in nature are, so to speak, the evils proper to this nature. Her very character decreed that if she were corrupted, the corruption would take this form and not another. The horrors of parasitism and the glories of motherhood are good and evil worked out of the same basic scheme or idea. The characters he's describing here, we could, even if you're not familiar with the stories he's talking about, like, the Merry Wives of Windsor or Othello or any of Dickens's novels, even if you're not familiar with those characters, you can put this in the flavor of people you know in your own life. The evils and the goods that you encounter in people you know, family members or friends or strangers, these take on their own flavor in each individual. The evils that a brother or a sister or a cousin present to you are presented in a unique way in each individual. If your brother falls into something evil, it's different than if it has a different flavor than if your sister falls into something evil. This is their individuality coming through, right? This is their unique character coming through. And nature in this way has its own flavor, its own tang. He says it's not even though it is fallen in the Christian view of things, even though it is something that needs to be redeemed. It's not part of some divine plan it's not part of some contrived plan that it be this way. Its character is there in its goods and its evils, in its glories and its tragedies. He juxtaposes parasitism, the idea of something living off of something else, with the glories of motherhood, which could be characterized as a kind of parasitism because a child lives off of its mother in a very extreme way in the womb, and then in another way when it's born. It's not connected biologically to the mother when it's out of the womb, but is connected maybe in a deeper way even when it is out of the womb. So there is a parasitic element there, but nobody who had any sort of well-rounded character would characterize motherhood as parasitism. You would call it something glorious. You'd call it something wonderful. You may even call it the highest moral good that a human can achieve, right? So both of these flavors are in nature, fallen or otherwise, and Lewis seems to be saying that it must be this way. There's no way around it. I spoke just now about the Latinity of Latin. It is more evident to us that, it is more evident to us than it can have been to the Romans. Why? Because we're outside of it. The Romans who spoke Latin probably didn't understand its Latinness, its Latinity, as he says, the way we do if we studied Latin. In the same way that the Spanishness of Spanish isn't evident to a Spanish speaker in the same way it might be to a French speaker or to an English speaker. Because when they come to Spanish from outside of it, they understand why it's different. When you grow up in it, when you're ensconced in it, the nuances of it, the flavor of it, may not be as apparent to you, right? And the English is probably the same way. I'm certain it's the same way. If you come to it from another language, if you come to it from another culture, you could probably sense its Englishness more than most English speakers can. The Englishness of English is audible only to those who know some other language as well. In the same way, and for the same reason, only supernaturalists really see nature. You must go a little way away from her, and then turn round and look back. Then at last the true landscape will become visible. See, so his early inclinations as a young man, that to look at nature as with a creator behind it, or a creator of it, and something behind it, that sort of took away nature's flavor and its beauty and its authenticness, its unsolicitedness. That was wrong, he says. It's only supernaturalists who understand nature truly, who can see nature's real flavor, who can see nature's real nuances. Just like the English speaker can see Spanish's nuances, or the Spanish speaker can see English's nuances better than the native English speaker or the native Spanish speaker. Because they're able to get out of it, turn around and look at it and say, I see it for what it is. I see it in total, right? He earlier in the book, he told a story of a Native American person who several hundred years ago had been raised by English speakers. He spoke his own native language, and he was raised, had a classical education, became very well educated, understood several languages, read and wrote them. And other linguists who he studied around came to him and said, we'd like you to write a grammar of your own language so that we could learn it, so that we could have some record of it. And when he thought about it for a moment, he said it doesn't have a grammar. Well, of course it did have a grammar, but he didn't know what it was because he had grown up in it. He didn't have a view of it. He didn't have a sort of technical or academic view of it. This happens with Spanish. I mean, I speak just a little bit, and you're fluent, of course, and when I've talked about some of the things in Spanish that are unique, I use phrases, I use terms that are academic, right? I'll use participles and past tenses and present tenses, and you just speak it. That stuff doesn't really occur to you as much. That's because that's the way I had to learn it. I had to learn it through books. I had to learn that there are levels to it. There are differences in it from English, and I had to learn what those differences are rather than being raised in the differences. And he says, also in that way, only the supernaturalists can really understand nature. They are that English speaker trying to learn Spanish, going back and looking at nature and going, because there's a different thing, a God, a supernatural realm or world, or all these words fall short, but whatever that is, because there's that, we can get in that, look back at nature and see her for what she is, and appreciate her for what she is. More importantly, you must go a little way away from her, and then turn round and look back. Then at last the true landscape will become visible. You must have tasted, however briefly, the pure water from beyond the world before you can be distinctly conscious of the hot, salty tang of nature's current. To treat her as God, or as everything, is to lose the whole pith and pleasure of her. Come out, look back, and then you will see. This astonishing cataract of bears, babies, and bananas, this immoderate deluge of atoms, orchids, oranges, cancers, canaries, fleas, gases, tornadoes, and toads. How could you ever have thought this was the ultimate reality? How could you ever have thought that it was merely a stage set for the moral drama of men and women? She is herself. Offer her neither worship nor contempt. Meet her and know her. If we are immortal, and if she is doomed, as the scientists tell us, to run down and die, we shall miss this half-shy and half-flamboyant creature, this ogress, this hoyden, this incorrigible fairy, this dumb witch. But the theologians tell us that she, like ourselves, is to be redeemed. The vanity to which she was subjected was her disease, not her essence. She will be cured in character, not tamed, heaven forbid, nor sterilized. We shall still be able to recognize our old enemy, friend, and playfellow, and foster mother, so perfected as to be not less but more herself. And that will be a merry meeting.